Most men in the lines on Okinawa knew little more than what was happening in their line of sight, what threatened from the next cave or rise or tree stump. Those who lived a week or more became marvellously expert in that, the constant proximity of death honing animal instincts and senses into a new nature. By the time Dick Whittaker's company reached Loaf on May 17th, he well knew that the difference between life and death often depended on what we smelled and heard. Officers and non-commissioned officers learned to take special precautions because they were priority targets. When Owen Stebbins was hit on May 12, it was almost certainly after Japanese machine gunners spotted Ed Roos running to his forward observation post for their quick parley. Following the runner, they aimed for the captain, the top man. The Japanese were expert enough in eliminating leaders to generate privates' compassion for their superiors. Day after day, single shots took down sergeants and second lieutenants crouched with their men, and also communications specialists carrying radios, and everyone involved with command. Night after night, infiltrators found their way to the foxholes of Americans who'd been carefully selected during the day. "I can't tell you how many lieutenants we went through," a company G222 private would commiserate. That was why distinguishing armament such as .45 caliber pistols were tucked out of sight, why Captain Stebbins and all other officers rarely risked using their binoculars, and why you never ever mentioned rank in the field, as Ed DeMar would put it. Japanese snipers seemed uncannily patient and skilled at selecting anyone whose loss was likely to hurt more than that of an ordinary rifleman. It was amazing how they could pick out anyone in command, sometimes just from the way they talked to others. That's why everyone tried to look as dumb and dirty as everyone else. Americans also learned to hide everything: maps, binoculars, stripes or bars of rank that would distinguish them from foot sloggers. Salutes were anathema. Any rifleman who saluted an officer on the line, targeting him for an enemy sniper, would have been in deep trouble, William Manchester would note. Marine contempt for army leaders who supposedly put themselves in peril by maintaining ranks rituals on the line actually revealed as much about their snobbery as the reality. For despite the Army's generally greater distance between fighting officers and men, its combat units fought the same war and learned the same lessons as the Marines. DeMar would remember laughing at, probably apocryphal, Army officers who wore their insignia in combat. The day before we went in, anything and everything came off that could single you out. If you didn't know a captain or a major by sight, and he came up to you, you wouldn't know who he was. And if you guessed, you didn't show it to those Japs out there watching to see who gave the orders. That became second nature. Similarly, medical corpsmen tried to be known personally by the units they attended, so wounded men would call Jones or Bangert instead of Corpsman or Doc. Japanese soldiers sometimes shouted the generic titles in order to pick off the men who ran out to help. New replacements, however, often had no time to learn their corpsmen's names. Their failure to know and sense a great deal more accounted for the high proportion killed or wounded on their first days and even hours. Thousands came up to the front full of expectation and anxiety, saw the truth of combat, for which none was truly prepared, did something without the necessary artfulness, and, all in their first day, were delivered to a medical facility with grievous wounds and eyes still dumb with shock and disbelief. No matter how rigorous Marine infantry training tried to be, only combat itself could teach real combat smarts. The training had made much of never bunching up, so that no single mortar shell could hit more than 1 or 2 men, but green men kept being killed in bunches formed of fright. It was only after they saw this happen that an instinct to stay apart developed, yet not too far apart, because riflemen needed each other's protection on every flank. Then that instinct was further refined, and they kept the optimal distance in varying terrains of plains, hills, woods, and escarpments. American infantrymen who survived a month in the line became as professionally skilled and personally cauterized as infantrymen anywhere. From the positioning of canteens to the placement of an extra knife under their shirts, Everything they wore and carried was readied for the best chance to kill before being killed. Experience had taught that, in this, all the skill in the world counted less than good luck, especially during an assault against a fortified position, when no one had any control over what ground a hidden Nambu light machine gun would spray or where a mortar shell would fall. Everyone knew that some of the most reckless men went miraculously unscathed, and some of the most prudent and expert were blown to bits, that practicing every measure of protection couldn't prevent one's own number from coming up. Still, expertise offered slightly better odds of surviving. Men had seen the slack of rifle slings spell the difference between life and death. Needless to say, they disagreed about such fine points as whether or not to tape down hand grenades. Many hung them on the handiest place, their pack straps, but others, having seen the terrible accidents they inevitably caused, feared they might explode there, or one would fall off. The trade-off, added safety versus a second's delay using them, was disputed, but not by those whose experience brought them firmly down on one side or the other, like those who did tape, but forgot to remove it in time and were almost finished by that tiny delay in throwing one. Usually you didn't have a chance to learn from your mistakes, Norris Bokta would reflect, because they got you killed. As in all modern wars, ears became acutely sensitive to menaces broadcast by sounds, especially of the varieties of incoming fire. Each whoosh, whine and whiz identified a bullet or shell type with its individual trajectory and proximity. One low-velocity shell could actually be seen approaching, tumbling end over end. It was the new Japanese screaming Mimi, or boxcar, or garbage can, a 320mm spigot mortar detonated by a propellant charge struck with a mallet. The 32nd Army had 24 of them. Their launching shriek, like a locomotive from hell, and earth-shaking thunder when the 650-pound shells hit shredded the stretched nerves even of the veterans who knew they were extremely inaccurate, unlike the little Japanese knee mortar, a simple, deadly weapon that gave almost no warning. Many veterans were also convinced they could smell the enemy, just as the enemy could surely smell them, the consumers of so much animal fat. Nip's smell was said to be sweetish, a little like talcum powder. If you sniffed it in your foxhole at night, every nerve quivered until dawn, an infantryman would remember. And sure enough, you'd find evidence that your perimeter line had been penetrated. But you didn't need evidence. You had your senses. Combat also sired a kind of medical wisdom. Even at the tender age of 18, another infantryman would recall, you learned a lot about the different aspects of wounds and what reaction to expect. A wounded man, able to walk with help or talk, clearly prompted smiles. Those were signs that he wasn't in serious shock, but calls for mothers were ominous. People who called Mama didn't survive. The sharpened senses and new powers of observation and analysis instantly assessed the relative dangers of new strongpoints and terrain. A silent counter recorded the number of Japanese rounds expended, since the dreaded Nambu light machine gun, for example, almost always fired bursts of 6 to 8 rounds. Eyes almost automatically registered possible evidence of mines and booby traps. Bodies purged themselves of superfluous movement. A new semi-conscious process considered each movement before it was made. Should the window of that half-standing hut be peeked through from the left or right? Should the next grenade be held an extra 2 seconds to prevent the targets from throwing it back? Should it be thrown with the right hand or left, which would allow quicker operation of the trigger finger? Should the rock ahead be jumped over in 1 bound or 2? Is it time to move now? Is a sniper or machine gunner zeroing in? Bodies tuned themselves for supreme silence and stealth, which meant reducing combat gear to a minimum. Every day you learned more, as one Marine would put it, and the more you learned, the more you chucked from your kit. You lived by your wits, which meant travelling light. Gas masks had been discarded on the landing beaches, and the bulkiest non-essential equipment, such as supply packs with the extra pair of boots, quickly followed. Experience has shown that a soldier will not carry equipment for which he has no apparent need, a confidential army report titled Principal Lessons Learned in the Okinawa Operation would confirm. Every essential item was fixed on the body or in the pack so that it wouldn't make a noise by moving or shattering. If you had to move quickly, even with full gear, the only sound would be your muffled footsteps, Whitaker would remember. With some of their self-inflation also discarded, the Marines came closer to their image of themselves as the best fighters in the world, although the more worldly would later doubt whether they'd been better than the best Japanese. Veteran infantrymen would realize how much combat had changed them, almost into a new species with vastly developed physical senses and almost everything else, including ethical considerations, shed like hazardous baggage. Although that was nothing new in war, this longest, largest, most intense land campaign in the Pacific reduced more participants to such a primitive state. Infantrymen on Okinawa came to feel that their changed muscles, senses, instincts, everything had been designed for war and savage war alone, and that this was almost natural. Norris Buchter's first view of combat veterans on Guadalcanal, where the 6th Marine Division was being formed, had frightened him. They were jungle animals. Nothing we could relate to, nothing to fool around with. Really tough and probably on the verge of going wacky from battle fatigue. You knew they belonged to another world. After his 6 weeks on Okinawa, he heard a replacement speak of his own group just that way, and realized they'd had to become those same new creatures. It's from living on the edge too long, using your wits each minute to survive. It's watching, listening, thinking of what to expect next. Not like just an animal, but a hunted animal. You've seen so much horror. It's just a different life, indescribable. Heightened instincts or not, men in the lines had a more limited perspective than almost anyone farther removed, perhaps because ignorance of events outside the immediate environment was necessary to free minds for the requisites of survival. Owen Stebbins felt his men's real life was generally 20 yards on either side of their foxholes, and Manchester agreed. No Marine in the middle of a firefight, however clever he may have been, knew any more about the foe than the rifleman in the next foxhole. Many on Okinawa literally didn't know where they were during the fighting. I obviously knew when we got into Naha, one would recall. Otherwise, I had almost no idea. We weren't told, and maybe we didn't want to know or couldn't know. Our minds were full of other things. Without ever hearing Napoleon's saying about the combat soldier seeing only the pack of the man in front of him, Dick Whitaker knew exactly what it implied. Maybe the Japanese knew more than we did. At least they might have recognized some landmarks. This was the hill they used to watch the stars from. That was the road they used to take to the beach. We didn't even know where we were or what lay beyond the nearest trees. All we had was a grunt of "follow me" from somebody in front, and a hope that he knew where the hell he was going, which he often didn't. Hundreds of men died on Loaf, never having heard its nickname. Many survivors never learned details that would roll from the tongues of war buffs. Superiors didn't necessarily keep information from the participants out of calculation. It was just as likely to be a sharing of ignorance. I think one of the reasons we were never told anything was that nobody knew anything, Stuart Upchurch, who turned 18 5 days after L-Day, would conclude. I followed orders, not knowing what they meant, a Sugarloaf survivor from another company would recall. When my platoon sergeant said we were taking Hill 63 tomorrow morning, that meant nothing to me. Hill 63 was just another ugly mound with blackened tree stumps that you and your guys had to crawl up, hoping it wouldn't be your last. Private Thomas Hanaher of Minnesota would become one of the campaign's more thoughtful veterans, remembering with horror the cost to his friends and to Okinawans. But during the fighting itself, he was almost wholly unaware of most concerns, larger than keeping his head down and his weapon oiled. Hanaher's private world was his battery of 75mm pack howitzers, which operated closer to the infantry than any other artillery apart from the 37mm and heavy mortars. Still, that was a precious few hundred yards from the much more awful front lines. One ridge made a huge difference. It was no lark for us, another artilleryman would remember. We lived with quite enough danger even when we weren't being shelled. A man on the gun next to mine was killed by muzzle blast, for example. But we didn't have that constant feeling of imminent death, counting your days because they're numbered. When we saw those ragged, groggy infantrymen trudging somewhere, we felt real admiration for them. They were on the fighting edge, the real war, and we felt proud to support them, but from a different world. American infantry got huge support from those close-range howitzers, in addition to long-range artillery, the naval flotilla's massive guns, and the swarms of Army, Marine, and naval aircraft. But as the writer Bill Ross said about Iwo Jima 2 months earlier, the ultimate weapon on Okinawa remained a young man with a rifle. That was why infantry officers, those most perishable creatures, looked a little down on all others, even those in tank units. Land had to be seized and held, said Owen Stebbins. That was the only way the war could be won, on the ground. The proximity to the Japanese on the ground depended on whether they'd fortified an area and when they decided to make a charge. At the moments of contact, it was often close enough for Whitaker to hear Japanese songs, whispers, the clatter of utensils, and once a shout of, "Babe Ruth eats shit." If you left your foxhole and advanced, sooner or later you'd meet a Jap who was out there with a single purpose, to kill you. That's how close, the 20 or 30 paces you could lob a grenade. Sometimes you didn't have time to aim your weapon, you just fired and fired from any possible position and hoped your buddies kept pouring it on while you reloaded. Close was what it was all about. That's how you took ground. The infantrymen who did that also often hugged the ground as tightly as they could. Very occasionally something drove a sprinkling of them to the kind of feat dramatized in war movies, an unmanageable surge of adrenaline or exhaustion even beyond the ordinary, or nerves snapping because they couldn't stand the terror of being pinned down any longer. Sometimes it was a saintly calculation that all would die unless one took an otherwise lunatic risk. Okinawa's heroes disagree about why they performed their wild acts of gallantry. Some mention devotion to their beloved unit, whom an evil enemy was trying to kill. One former sergeant, who charged Sugarloaf, although dazed with exhaustion, swears it was all a mistake because he'd intended to run away from the fire instead of toward it. Then, when all the Americans near him were shot, he lay down, absolutely quivering with terror. Mistakes, lack of imagination, and stupidity were indeed among the explanations for supreme courage. Some men couldn't imagine themselves dead, or the decisions to risk everything were made because the fighters just became too utterly disgusted with the battlefield's unspeakable existence, as one would modestly interpret his action. They became so full of revulsion against that hideous life that anything was preferable. Some heroes appeared unnatural to average infantrymen. When one future winner of the Navy Cross stood up like a bear with his bar, shouting, "Come on out, you sons of bitches!" a machine gunner who would later offer that description watched in wonder. A man who stood up on the front line day after day almost looked like he wanted to get killed. He must have had a screw loose. No sensible man would do those things. Some of that species of hero would become problems back in civilian life. Whatever the reasons, a handful bolted from their cover on a few occasions and charged enemy positions, shouting and firing. Those rare exceptions fill much of the standard American accounts of the battle, such as a lore-filled homage by James and William Belote titled Typhoon of Steel, which is rich in give-'em-hell action scenes where the good guys stand tall and dish it out. "Let's go, men," reads a typical passage describing an officer leaping to his feet and running into a deadly ravine. When superiors heard of such exploits, a medal was possible, even the Congressional Medal of Honor, of which 23, the largest number of any campaign in the war, were awarded for conspicuous gallantry on Okinawa. They served as the material for the bulk of traditional battle literature, filled with storybook warriors shouting inspirational challenges or curses as they wielded their weapons like figures from manly dreams, down to grins as they took on the enemy and stopped them with a blaze of glory. But battlefield men knew that bravado, even without the comic book dialogue, was no more typical than decorations were an accurate record of heroism. While a top-heavy percentage went to officers in command posts 200 yards behind the line, many heroic acts out in front went unrewarded because no one survived to witness them. I saw men do braver things than those who got the highest decorations but were never cited, an Okinawa veteran would recall. Besides, decorations tend to romanticize the hellish misery called war. Combat infantrymen learned the luck that helped determine who won medals was as unfair as in the matter of who survived and who didn't. Some of the bravest men walked away after their heroic acts, wanting and getting no reward other than saving their comrades. Major Courtney, as mentioned, assigned Corporal Dan Dereshuk to protect his right flank on Sugarloaf, and Dereshuk's 8 men dwindled to 3, one with a bad stomach wound. All night, the 2 utterly exhausted and partially wounded, fit heroes kept the Japanese at bay with rifles and hand grenades. After their evacuation at dawn, Dereshuk was patched up and returned to combat without rest or citation. Whatever the merits and demerits of awards, the rare courage of the standouts represented a tiny fraction of the total man-hours on the line. A military historian's study concluded that only a quarter of men under fire in World War II and the Korean War fired back. The majority were too frightened to put into practice their intense training focused on precisely that. Although Army and Marine infantrymen surely performed far better on Okinawa, they spent much more time taking cover than leaping up from it. The Whitakers dug into the ground, vision restricted to the patch of charred terrain they could see from the lips of their foxholes, with no glimpse of the larger picture. In that sense, this account is as misleading as all others about the war in the killing zone, because the real war will never get in the books, as Walt Whitman, a hospital nurse during the Civil War, declared. Those about combat are in a way its reverse, and to the degree that the Battle of Okinawa was harder than its predecessors, that's more than ordinarily true about this one. News of Nazi Germany's collapse and of VE Day had reached Okinawa the day before Paul Dunphy scouted beyond the Asakawa, 4 days before Sugarloaf. Many of the ships in the bays held services of Thanksgiving, and battleships and cruisers joined field artillery in sending a huge salvo at enemy positions. The Japanese had no idea what prompted the earth-shaking thunder, but neither did many Americans on the ground, and even those who did know didn't much care. To men soaked with rain, covered with mud, and peering ahead for a glimpse of a rifle pointed at them, Europe meant little more than a place that was draining off the best supplies. To hell with that war! This is the one I'm worried about. Dick Whittaker felt the defeat of Nazism was happening on another planet. We didn't think much about what was happening on the next hill, not to mention Germany. They told us it was all over in Europe, but it sure as hell wasn't all over for us, another Sugarloaf survivor would remember. The thing we really cared about was how soon some troops would be here from Europe to help us out. The death of Franklin Roosevelt on April 12th, almost a month earlier, had greater significance for many fighters, most of whom had known only one president in their lives. But it was on the anchored or patrolling ships that the greatest grief was felt, or in the supply and reserve forces. Still, while many wept who weren't in the line, those who were felt only some pangs of sadness between dodging bullets and shells. They were too busy trying to catch their breath, catch some sleep, and stay alive. In America, Roosevelt's death and VE Day were among the events that helped keep the desperate hardships on Okinawa from reaching the public consciousness. The president's funeral, daily new evidence of the collapse of German defences, and Harry Truman's early weeks in the White House seemed more important and relevant news. Throughout the first month of fighting on Okinawa, editors who'd long given greater prominence to the European war kept that up by allotting much more space to the dramatic assault on Berlin and the German surrender. Mussolini dead, Yanks meet, Red Army on the Elbe, Berlin falls, Hitler, suicide in his bunker. Compared to that, the Okinawan campaign was just another slog on a remote island. The greatest land-sea-air battle in history was usually reported on inside pages, and attention quickly shifted to new, again more dramatic stories of the Nazi death camps, Europe's future, and the imminent invasion of the Japanese mainland. Although Okinawa was now what a historian would call the vortex of the war, that recognition would never enter the public consciousness. Few dispatches from the island offered clues to the nature of the fighting. Almost all conveyed an optimistic summary of its overall progress and provided colour about men interviewed behind the lines. Reporters weren't exactly prevaricating in that. It's worth repeating that most military service in 1945 was quite different from actual fighting. Combat, the real thing, had always been a relatively small part of military life, involving far fewer soldiers for far fewer days than its planning. Armies prepared by drilling, conferring, and cleaning latrines. Only the men on their outer edges fell to bludgeons, swords, scimitars, and arrows. And since more sophisticated weapons required more personnel to transport and service them, technological development further reduced actual combat's proportion. The worst of war is hell, but there isn't much of the worst, and not many soldiers experience even that much, a journalist veteran summarized. Or, as Edward N. Luttwak put it, battle is no more characteristic of war than copulation is of marriage. Luttwak, a student of military affairs, argued that this helps explain why combat remains part of the human experience, instead of being swept away by the outrage of those who have been in its hell and have come back to tell the tale. The Americans who fought their way past the deadly Okinawan caves represented a tiny fraction even of those serving in the Pacific at the time. On average, each was supported by 19 others, usually from a considerable distance. Most of those 19 endured varying degrees of discomfort, but were as spared from the real horror as civilians. It was only within rifle range of the enemy where life became unlike anything previously imagined. Most reporters ventured no closer than 500 yards. Ernie Pyle went farther than most. World War II's most celebrated American correspondent landed on Okinawa on L-Day afternoon and quickly began filing stories with his flair for the intimate. Almost single-handedly, he'd compelled Congress to award mudslogging doughboys the combat infantryman's badge and extra pay. The Marine establishment declined both, asserting that all Marines were combat troops. As in the European theatre, where he'd won his name and affection by writing from ground level rather than command heights, Pyle appeared to tell it like it was. Infantry's friend even toured a sideshow on the little island of Ieshima, just 4 miles from the Motobu Peninsula in the north, where the Marines had overcome Colonel Udo's mountain artillery. Ieshima, one of several offshore islands close enough to be almost extensions of Okinawa, accommodated Asia's largest airfield on its 11 square miles. Photographic evidence indicated it was undefended, which seemed confirmed by an absence of fire on attacking American planes. Actually, a strongly fortified mountain overlooked the field. Pyle stepped ashore on April 17th. The next morning, a machine gun fired on the jeep taking him toward the fighting. It killed the most famous and beloved civilian of all the United States services. According to a respected military historian, the shock brought the Okinawan campaign to the attention of millions back home. Not really. The loss of that single life simply became news, while battles that were taking thousands and locking tens of thousands in daily agony remained nearly unknown. In 6 days of fighting on Ieshima, 240 Americans were killed and 1,000 wounded. The New Yorker's John Lardner called it a quick and otherwise unnoteworthy little special campaign, except for Pyle's death. The irony is that Pyle's dispatches from Okinawa, as elsewhere, were far too pretty to convey any real sense of the fighting. Although his stories came a tad closer to the filth and pain than most others, they still missed by a mile, as they had to. "It's humiliating to look back at what we wrote during the war," a Canadian reporter would later admit. "It was crap, and I don't exclude the Ernie piles. I suppose there wasn't an alternative at the time. It was total war. But for God's sake, let's not glorify our role. It wasn't good journalism. It wasn't journalism at all." As for Pyle in particular, Paul Fussell fairly likened his copy to emissions from the Office of War Information. Dispatches from Okinawa outdid themselves in masking rather than conveying the hardships, partly because they were so extreme. Whatever few facts they supplied, their tone and assumptions fed the usual cheerleading prevarications. A few non-professionals who took the trouble to jot down their impressions got much closer to the truth, as in an officer's notes about the demolished village of Gusukuma. Accredited correspondents omitted almost all such details, and without the almost when describing the home team. Most of their human interest stories and Hi Mom features about hometown boys could only mislead readers about life in the field, not to mention Japanese behaviour. There was no mention of all-night retching with disease and fear, no moans or screams or mental disintegration, let alone shot-off faces and testicles. Despite Pyle's half-step closer to some aspects of the real thing, his outlook helped explain why Europe's less grueling and cruel fighting got more recognition. Sent to the Pacific in late 1944 under heavy official pressure, he continued to believe the European war was more important. And his treatment of Okinawan civilians helps explain why the major story of the campaign, measured in real human interest, wasn't told at all to the good folks back home. His little vignettes had Okinawans going their oriental inscrutable ways, while they were actually suffering horrendously. Even the best journalism in the most authoritative pages now reads like fluff. Battle hardships were couched in images of a hard-fought but essentially sane sporting event. Leathernecks and doughboys of the 10th Army held the Japanese key fortress of Shuri in a giant cup-shaped pincers today, as they turned both ends of the Okinawa battle line. Pyle's accounts of Americans' misery ventured all the way to the infernal biting of Okinawan fleas and mosquitoes, as if that was what distinguished infantrymen's ordeal from normality. The reality later revealed in the memoir of Eugene Sledge, a pious 18-year-old Marine, would have almost nothing in common with the dispatches filed at the time. "I felt sickened to the depths of my soul," Sledge wrote of his first taste of combat. "I asked God, why? I had tasted the bitterest essence of the war, and it filled me with disgust." The why of ignoring war's bitterest essence is easier to explain than the why of war itself. Reporters played on the same team as the fighters, or didn't get to the game. Having provided exclusive access to the material, the military exercised tight control on how it was written up. A maverick convinced the truth was more important and courageous enough to defy all convention of supporting the American side wouldn't have lasted long. The great war correspondent John Steinbeck knew that the foolish reporter who broke the rules would not be printed at home, and in addition would be put out of the theatre by the command. We were all part of the war effort. David Lloyd George had put the reality in a nutshell. The correspondents don't write, and the censorship would not pass the truth. Whitaker's cheery letters home also left the bitter essence unmentioned. Even with the talent to convey it to outsiders, he'd not have wanted to attract the censor's attention or distress his parents. Other letter writers tried to hint that there was much to tell, but despaired of communicating its immensity. "So far I have been very lucky," went a typical passage on Red Cross stationery, "and I know it is because of all your prayers and mine. I have a lot to tell you when I am in a position to, and that isn't right now." But that writer, like most survivors when they returned, would never be able to tell his family, despite their great closeness. There was no way to describe it because it was beyond every imaginable aspect of life. Or, in Dick Whitaker's take, "It's really very hard to describe what it was like on Okinawa. Almost anything you did could get you killed, including absolutely nothing. All of that gave the home front, less equipped to picture Pacific conditions to begin with, a much vaguer notion of the fighting on Okinawa than it had of more familiar Europe. The American public was further disadvantaged because generations had been protected from bombing, shelling, and mutilation. Apart from the minority who fought, they were largely conditioned to assume war's victims to be mostly the enemy, who'd brought things on themselves. But even if reporters had lived on the killing edge and could have reported honestly, the battle's ways differed too greatly from anything their audience could have imagined from newspaper or radio copy. Almost all infantrymen at the Shuri line periodically felt the experience wasn't happening because it couldn't, it was too unnatural. Ponds of ochre floodwater on the lowlands became lakes that swallowed 8-wheel trucks. Replacement troops dug their first foxholes, took cover in the soup-like mud, and were in water to their waists within an hour. Elsewhere, the ground was everywhere so slippery that some men used their precious rifles as walking sticks. No one on the line had a moment's escape from the all-submerging mud. "You were knee-deep in it," Joseph McConville would remember. "Sometimes you slept standing up in it." Day after day, men shivered in their puckered skin. An outbreak of typhoid occurred during those downpours. Jungle rot spread from feet to the crotch. Ringworm in the belt area was sometimes so painful that combat troops couldn't wear their packs or cartridge belts. In World War I, a painful condition caused by prolonged exposure to wet and mud was called trench foot. Now it was immersion foot, and dry feet became a longed-for luxury. Dick Whittaker's reeked of mud and the sweat of exertion and fear. He wore the same socks and the same underwear for weeks. Men who found streams for washing on their breaks from fighting had to cut off their socks. When a jeep towed up a large tank of water one day to where Whittaker's platoon had been pulled back from the line, each man was allotted a helmetful. Whittaker had a bath with his and felt gloriously clean. Then he dressed, saving for last a pair of treasured clean socks he'd been carrying in his pack. Standing on a tall rock, he lost his balance pulling on the second one and fell into a pond of muck. It was much more tragic than funny at the time, too much like the rifles that fell into the same stuff when a bullet or shell knocked their users flat, then wouldn't fire. When enemy soldiers on Loaf approached one man whose rifle was useless with mud, he frantically kicked the bolt home with his foot, then had to hope it wouldn't explode in his face when he fired. He was lucky. He kept kicking and firing. The battles for Loaf and all the Shuri Line's other strong points took place during the most torrential deluges. Sleepless pilots would hear the rain beating down and wonder whether it would ever stop. They lived in a world of water and mud, their feet stuck in the gluey bog of the company street of tents, their clothing and bedding never dry. Those were the lucky pilots in the rear who had tents and bedding to get wet, so unlike the infantrymen. After charges at those strong points, clusters of survivors huddled not only in mourning for their dead and fear for themselves, but also in the cold rain's soaking, incessant misery beyond description. Battlefield mud compounded it. Vehicles using Okinawa's dirt track roads during the dry months produced a blinding cloud of thick red dust, which now turned to sludge that clung to everything. Men without a suction-breaking covering of burlap bags on their boots needed help to pull themselves out. Jeeps got mired. The trucks, tractors and bulldozers that came to the rescue were swallowed. Tanks disappeared in lakes of ooze. The need for ammunition and other supplies being insatiable, infantrymen, often near exhaustion from combat's physical demands and mental tension, had to take on the extra work of carrying as much as they could on their shoulders and backs, wading through quagmires impassable by motorized transport. Most of war's literary and cinematic dramatization blithely ignores that grueling facet of the infantryman's war, as Private Sledge would later call it. It implies that ammunition happens to be at hand whenever needed for giving the enemy hell. Every time veteran Whittaker would see a movie hero who never ran out of ammunition, he'd remember the way Okinawa's few moments of intense firing could exhaust the precious supply and leave him defenseless, The average infantryman, even those not lugging extra weapons like machine guns, bars, flamethrowers, or satchel charges, was a small arsenal. He heaved his way through the mud with his rifle, backpack, and a cartridge belt, containing 8 to 10 clips of 8 rounds each, a considerable burden in itself. 2 to 4 hand grenades dangled from his belt, and since that supply could be exhausted in minutes during emergencies, only the weight kept most from carrying more. Whitaker had a constant fear that an enemy bullet would hit one of the grenades he clipped to his cartridge belt or pack strap. The combined load made very heavy exercise of combats running, dashing, and crawling under fire. Whitaker's 2 steel boxes of 30 caliber ammunition were in addition to his other burdens. Although he and other machine gun carriers improvised cushions and shoulder straps, their arms felt as if they were coming out of their sockets after 20 minutes of lugging, which lasted hours on and off. They were weakened by lack of food, sleeplessness, and at least a touch of dysentery. Hauling was even harder when much of the front was a morass, and when Japanese artillery, zeroed in on every road near the Shuri line, forced them into rice paddies. Carrying the wounded was harder still, and more nerve-wracking. Strong young men became so exhausted that they hesitated to put down their loads for fear they wouldn't be able to pick them up again. An ammunition carrier in another machine gun platoon would bear his load across one large rice paddy farther south, then fall to the ground. If a Jap had come around a tree and aimed at me, I truly wouldn't have been able to move. It wasn't exhaustion, but stupefaction. Melvin Hecht, leader of the decimated machine gun platoon, found some humour in it. Here I am now 20 years old, and I don't feel a day over 40. In keeping with Murphy's law of war, mandating that those who have it worst should also be worst sustained, fighting men on Okinawa ate wretchedly. Combat so strained the nervous system that many couldn't swallow much anyway, despite their enormous expenditure of energy. All had almost constant thirst and worried about supplies of water only less than of ammunition. The oily-tasting liquid was brought up in 5-gallon tanks. The grateful recipients dropped a purification pill, not always effective against dysentery, inside the slimy green shit and drank as if in the desert. But many had to force themselves to eat. Basic nourishment was almost always available in the form of a K ration in one's pack. The little box contained a sardine-size can of ungodly hash and cheese or ham and eggs, soluble coffee or lemonade, and some hard biscuits. The larger C ration offered a slightly more tempting can of pork and beans, but was heavier to carry, an important consideration to men who lacked the energy to be hungry and whose appetites were further depressed by constant fear and revulsion of the battlefield's sights and smells. Starting out thin, Whitaker could hardly afford his loss of £20, which was average. He lived for days on cigarettes, included in the rations, and on dog turds, fortified fruit and chocolate bars that provided quick energy and didn't melt in heat. You carried them in your pack until you thought you were starving. You took one bite and felt stuffed. Whitaker ate his single hot meal during the Shuri line fighting about a week after Loaf, when word was passed down that everyone should assemble with his mess kit because a truck was expected with mess hall chow. No one in the platoon had a mess kit by then, the metal being too given to dangerous rattles. Whitaker did have his canteen cup, into which a scoop of hamburger meat was plunked when he reached the truck. Then an orange was pushed at him to cap his feast. Another man's single hot meal arrived by parachute, but some had no hot food at all in 2 months of savage fighting. Kitchens were closed when the going got tough. Mess staffs were shifted to combat duties as riflemen and stretcher-bearers. Near the end of the campaign, a mobile kitchen was opened for a Marine unit that had had no hot food in nearly 2 months. A radio operator salivated as he speared a piece of hot cake, but he couldn't eat it, this time not for lack of appetite. Fearless flies twice the size of any he'd seen in America flew into his mouth before he could rush his first bite in. He didn't try again. Lice and fleas were separate, additional scourges. The fleas, generously hosted by native goats, infested the beaches, houses, villages, and now the foxholes too. Few infantrymen on either side were spared. The May 3 entry of a diary found on a dead Japanese soldier noted the lucky break of being assigned no night duty. But it was hot in his cave, and there were so many fleas and lice that I couldn't sleep a wink. However, those two insects that increasingly tormented the occupants of the caves and foxholes played second fiddle to monster flies. Japanese soldiers had been harried by tenacious, seemingly angry clouds of them even before the fighting began. They were as big as horseflies, one would remember, with red heads and fierce, glaring eyes. They swarmed all over our faces whenever we came close to the piles of garbage. Flies had previously fed on native night soil and other decay, but not extravagantly, since pre-war Okinawa threw out little. Growing piles of rubbish and untreated wastes that accumulated while the Japanese soldiers were digging the fortifications greatly increased their number, but they were nothing compared to the treats of combat's effluence that now littered the landscape. Ever larger and more relentless swarms feasted on the garbage, excrement, and rotting corpses now strewn over the battle sites. When Americans were lucky enough to be pulled off the front line for rest and regrouping, only a few hundred yards back, but with less likelihood of being hit, hot coffee often waited. Flies would attack it even as it was being poured, although the hand not holding the cup was fighting them off with maddened waves. Whitaker was one who craved coffee, anything liquid, despite his dead appetite. But if you put down a cup for 1 second, you could hardly see it when you looked again. The surface was covered solid by huge black insects, or green ones. When Marine units passed the ruins of a sugar refinery in late May, the grotesque specimens feasting on a thick dark ooze that had run from smashed vats of molasses and now stuck to the boots of the advancing troops prompted fear of an epidemic. Planes sprayed the area with disinfectant. The Japanese, probably suspecting the spray marked the start of chemical warfare by the racist American beasts, began shelling furiously with the remains of their artillery. The Americans, having left their gas masks on the beach on L Day, were equally frightened that the Japanese beasts would use the incident as a pretext to deploy their own chemical weapons. Americans believed the flies' trips from the corpses to their coffee helped spread the dysentery that plagued nearly everyone. There was also a mild outbreak of typhoid, caused by bacilli that fed in the native and military night soil. Weakness and loose bowels prompted some Marines on the line to leave their precious cover to run to a corpsman for paregoric. Many who wouldn't take that risk had to mess their pants. Whitaker was among the majority who had at least a touch of dysentery much of the time. On bad days, he'd vomit when he lay on his stomach and lose control of his bowels when he lay on his back. He tried to do neither, to live, by finding a position on my side, not always easy in a foxhole filled with mud and water. One product of the endemic dysentery lay before everyone's eyes and noses. Combat fronts had no sanitation facilities. When there was time and the risk was acceptable, a hole was dug several inches into the ground. During action on the line, however, the surface of the ground had to do for the hurried functions. The rain, shelling, garbage, dysentery, and rotting corpses in their various colours, making the land on which infantrymen lived all day and night worse than open cesspools. The pus and puke and slime and shit of 250,000 harrowed men mixed into the battlefield's seas of mud. John Keegan would point out that battle, always unpleasant for a minority of its participants, has increasingly become an intolerable experience for the majority. Modern warfare has transformed its environment into a hellhole even without the fighting. Okinawa veterans make the same point by suggesting that anyone truly interested in combat's reality can glimpse it in peacetime simply by living a week or two in a hole in the ground filled with water, mud, excrement, and gore, and listening to a recording of ceaseless artillery thunder. Without dysentery to drain your strength and swarms of flies feasting on the product of feverishly running bowels, without the maggots and stink of decaying corpses and the near impossibility of proper sleep, without even the shells, bullets, exhaustion and fear. A short spell there, in a drenching rain and filthy wet clothes and without proper food, will begin providing an inkling of an existence not conveyable by words or film. Eugene Sledge, whose searing memoir of Peleliu and Okinawa comes closest, fought with the 1st Marines at Wanna-Draw, 2 miles northeast of Sugarloaf. The stink of one area's half-flooded garbage pit a little farther south was worse than most, but Sledge's life depended on digging into it for cover. At 8 inches, he encountered a mass of wriggling maggots that came welling up as though those beneath were pushing them out. He had to keep digging. Minutes later, his spade hit a rotting Japanese corpse, dirty, whitish bone and cartilage with ribs attached, with an overwhelmingly nauseating odour. How I managed not to vomit, I don't know. Perhaps my senses and nerves had been so dulled by constant foulness for so long. Having to wallow in war's putrefaction was almost more than the toughest of us could bear. When volunteers to retrieve Sugarloaf's dead found the body of Major Courtney on May 15th, they had to break the future winner of the Medal of Honour's legs to make a smaller package that would lessen the danger of the dash back down through the Japanese fire. That afternoon, the exhausted litter-bearers hitched a ride back to their units in a raucous Amtrak with about 20 corpses and 8 inches of sloshing water in its well. One 18-year-old who had to ride above that well supported himself on a handle, but lost his grip when the vehicle climbed a knoll. He fell into the water, now full of maggots and body pieces. The putrid liquid rushed back at him whenever the Amtrak again made a climb, and the vehicle's roar drowned out his hysterical screams, so that his swallows and wrestles with the corpses continued until he blacked out. What I was thinking then and all through these years, until the 1980s, was, enough, we've been abused enough. But he was unable to mention such episodes for 41 years, until he fought to a breakthrough with the help of an enlightened veterans' hospital. Men didn't talk about such things at the time because, Sledge would explain, they were too horrible and obscene even for hardened veterans. The conditions taxed the toughest I knew almost to the point of screaming. It is too preposterous to think that men could actually live and fight for days and nights on end under such terrible conditions and not be driven insane. But I saw much of it there on Okinawa, and to me the war was insanity. Recent films that have begun to show young men gripped in combat's pandemonium of shocking noise, confusion and terror necessarily leave out combat's largest dirty secret, the pervasive filth and decay. Replacements making their way toward the front lines heard a rumbling like a distant thunderstorm. It grew louder and more ominous as they approached the heavy guns and the clamour of battle itself. The roar of tanks, whoomp of mortars, shriek of rockets, whoosh of shells streaming through the curtains of flame and dense dust of cordite. Men in Amtraks sometimes couldn't hear their roaring engines over the din, which was heightened by shouts and explosions. But the smell hit before the noise began to daze. Manchester would call it a stench of piss and shit and rotting human flesh. You are with men, all of whom, like yourself, have some shit in their pants and otherwise stink of battle. It was not an animal life, but worse. Sledge found his only way of bearing the monstrous horror of it all was to look away from it, upward to the rain clouds, and repeat again and again that he'd soon awaken from his nightmare. But the ever-present smell of death, the overpowering stench, saturated my nostrils. It was there with every breath I took. Coming from a culture that valued individual life, infantrymen took time to comprehend a world whose purpose was to extinguish it. But death became so common that they soon felt an odd dichotomy. They'd come to treasure the lives of their fellows, who could be lost at any moment, more than they had treasured any other. Yet all their lives together seemed of little consequence to the forces that had delivered them there. Especially heavy casualties among young platoon leaders kept the men from remembering their names or even faces, as when Dick Whittaker went up Sugarloaf. Those officers came and went too fast. Only 2 of the 21 Company I-322 officers who landed on L-Day weren't killed or seriously wounded. Several companies replaced some of their officers 3 and 4 times. Second lieutenants in rifle companies seemed to sledge a species made obsolete by modern warfare, wounded or killed with such regularity that we rarely knew anything about them. When the platoon tended by Courseman Joe Bangert, the erstwhile wise guy, went up Sugarloaf, he couldn't tell you my own lieutenant's name because we lost him so fast, and so many others. Stuart Upchurch's platoon went through so many that we started to just ignore the new ones. They really couldn't tell us anything we didn't know. The smart ones did well to learn from us. The second lieutenant in command of the platoon of James Day, the corporal destined to become a general, was killed in the field. His replacement died of wounds in a hospital. Most of the company's other officers fell, together with many of their superiors. His battalion commander and the battalion executive officer died in action. His regimental commander, a replacement for one seriously wounded on Sugarloaf, was killed days later. Nearly the entire regimental command structure was lost, and most of the troops. Day's battalion started with 1,145 men on April 4. When its fighting finished in June, some 3,000 past and present men were listed as having belonged, which meant each man had been replaced twice. On the day before Christmas 1944, a furious football game had been played in the Mosquito Bowl, a field pounded out of Guadalcanal's coral. Thanks to the Corps' appetite for recruiting athletes, the teams were studded with former college and professional stars, some of whom considered that game, played without shoulder pads or helmets, the roughest of their careers. 14 weeks later, at least 12 of the 60 players, including all Americans and other captains of college powerhouses, had been killed on Okinawa, and the other 48 wounded or injured almost to a man. 31 received the Purple Heart. The spectators fared better only by comparison. Casualties among the 9 infantry battalions that watched the game reached 75%. 400 officers and 7,822 enlisted men killed and wounded. After a few weeks on Okinawa, a college graduate who'd been haunted by not making an officer realized how lucky he was. He'd be the sole member of his 11-man machine gun section not killed or wounded seriously enough for evacuation. He'd started as an ammunition carrier like Whitaker, but all 10 men in front of him were shot, like ducks in a row. I was the last duck, but the campaign ended just in time. That was common. Melvin Hecht's 62-man platoon ended with 2 lucky ones. Sledge's company finished with 26 of the 235 officers and men who'd made the landing. The same percentage was left of Owen Stebbins's G222 company, 2 platoons of which ended with only 3 men from L-Day, one of whom was seriously wounded twice. Army infantry units suffered similarly, prompting efficiency experts who later analysed the campaign to recommend attaching a Graves registration platoon to each regiment because the personnel who dealt with the bodies proved insufficient and necessitated the employment of frontline troops to evacuate the dead. It's not quite true, as Marines like to remember, that they were stalwart to a man. One young private shot himself in the toe as his company advanced toward the Shuri line. His company had only 2 officers for some critical fighting a few days later because a junior one mysteriously disappeared, in the company commander's words, after 4 of his 6 fellow officers had been hit during the first day at Sugarloaf. The missing officer was found to have turned himself in sick to his battalion aid station. An officer of another company with shocking casualties stayed behind to cover his men's retreat one day until volunteers ran back with a poncho to drag him out from where he lay wounded. A courseman later noticed his leg wound bore signs of powder burns. Of the 1,000 men who were pinned down by machine gun fire on the way to Sugarloaf and waiting for the order to push on again through it, one burst out crying, threw away his rifle, and began crawling to the rear. Also, during the assault on the Shuri line, a fine regimental commander's failure lost him his command. After the Admiral's pressure on General Buckner to advance more rapidly, General Shepherd ordered Sugarloaf taken at any cost. When the cost became horrendous, the regimental commander in question, a tough, fully battle-tested Marine colonel, told the general he couldn't order his decimated regiment to carry out another attack on the hill. As with the colonel previously in the north, he was relieved, and his replacement did give the order. East of Sugarloaf, a 1st Marine Division battalion commander who had been ordered to take a fiercely fortified hill, objected that his men were all used up. Half of them belong in sick bay. The assistant divisional commander replied that the battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel, had his orders and that heads would roll if they weren't obeyed. The latter saluted and left, eyes tearing. "We'll take the fucking hill," he told an intelligence officer, "but I don't care if I come off it or not." The hill was taken, and the battalion commander wasn't wounded until later. The men obeyed. Incidents of refusal, even of corporals' orders, were astonishingly few. Whitaker was among the overwhelming majority who never saw or heard of one, or of cowardice. Not to advance when ordered was inconceivable for all but a statistically negligible minority. Almost no one wanted to charge the frightening danger, and only a small minority volunteered for especially hazardous assignments. A young Marine named Declan Klingenhagen was lucky enough to be skipped by his sergeant for what may have been the 12th assault on Sugarloaf. "I was sitting in a trench dug out of the bottom of a small hill, and I was apprehensive. I wasn't hiding because there were other Marines around, but I hoped no one would see me. I guess I was feeling fear. At one point, a longer-time member of my squad saw me and asked why I wasn't going with the assault. The sergeant was nearby and told the member to leave me alone. It was all right." The sergeant knew Klingenhagen's very first action as a replacement on Sugarloaf 3 days earlier had put him in a kind of shock. A mortar barrage killed his lieutenant and so ravaged his squad that only 4 men were able to withdraw. One of the 4 was badly wounded. Another lasted only until he reached the bottom of the hill, when he fell dead at Klingenhagen's feet with a bullet hole in his chest. Yet although the 18-year-old private sure hoped it wouldn't happen, he also knew he'd go up again if ordered. A seasoned military maxim posits that a combat unit that has taken casualties of 30% or more can't sustain its fighting spirit. Many frontline units on Okinawa went far above that, Whitaker's 29th Regiment to 82%. However true it was, as many Japanese survivors later saw it, that Americans won their assured victory largely by applying their greatly superior resources, it's thus also true that those at the killing edge behaved exceptionally. Another old adage that war is 90% logistics didn't diminish their record of surpassing courage and esprit de corps. Dick Whitaker was among the majority to whom it never occurred not to obey every order, and his wounds had been relatively trifling so far. 2 days after his charge up Sugarloaf on May 14th, he and his platoon's other survivors were on the back slope of a little rise 100 yards north. Exhausted and numb, they'd lost all their machine guns on the hill. Whitaker knew the wasted platoon would be ordered up again soon, but maybe not now, maybe not until tomorrow. That was all the future they could contemplate. Whitaker dug his foxhole deeper and stuck his shovel in the mud to light a cigarette. He leaned down toward a buddy's match, his left hand remaining on the shovel's handle. A sniper's bullet caught it there, exactly where his heart had been a second earlier. He made his own way to his battalion aid station, about half a mile to the rear. Cleaned and dressed, his wound seemed less serious than when the bullet struck. 3 days later, a doctor pronounced him fit for duty, and he returned to his unit, which was even smaller because it had charged Sugarloaf again in his absence. A month to the day after Whitaker was hit, Marine Corps headquarters in Washington wrote his parents that he'd been wounded in action against the enemy on. This was mistaken by 2 days, May 18th. Your anxiety is realized, and you may be sure that any additional details or information received will be forwarded to you at the earliest possible moment. That moment came more than a month later, when the campaign was over and Whitaker was back on Guam. The new note informed that he'd been returned to duty on May 20th. 2 weeks later, the 4th and 29th Marine Regiments attacked the Oroku Peninsula, site of Naha Airfield, and of the tunnels of the Naval Base Force and Captain Kojo's regimental headquarters. The day after their amphibious landing there on June 4th, Whitaker's platoon dodged small arms fire while advancing along the top of a ridge. When they came upon a forward artillery spotter peering through his binoculars, Whitaker asked what his objective was. The lieutenant handed him his glasses, through which he made out 3 Japanese soldiers studying a map on the next ridge. "Watch this," said the spotter, calling in some coordinates by radio. Moments later, the platoon heard American shells whizzing overhead. The 3 Japanese disappeared, together with the entire top of the ridge. Whitaker woke up in an Amtrak about half an hour later with no memory of how he got there. It might have been after being hit by a short round from an American gun. His head ached badly, blood flowed from his nose, and he couldn't hear. He supposed he was in the hands of a graves registration team, since the vehicle was also transporting poncho-wrapped bodies. In fact, he was being evacuated to a hospital ship, where he had his second hot meal. He'd never find out what had caused his concussion. He told his shipboard examiners that he didn't feel too bad, and was returned to a regimental hospital ashore. After a night there, he was checked again at his battalion aid station, which turned him loose to return to his outfit. Part of him knew he'd come through alive and without a disabling or disfiguring wound. Another part accepted how unlikely that was. All those people around you were getting hit, your turn just had to come too. Although every infantryman still secretly believed he was the exception whose turn would never come, all knew the heavy odds against that. "You do get letters from home, and you keep reading them," Norris Buchter of Connecticut would reflect, "but you've lost the feeling that you'll ever be back in that other world. You get to a time when you're resigned to your own death coming sooner or later. That only makes sense." Evan Regal, a lad from a struggling New York farm, felt certain it was a question of time. You might survive this battle or that, but sooner or later they'd get you. That was unavoidable. I tried not to think about it. I knew guys who had premonitions they were going to get it the next day, and often enough that's when they actually did get killed. Regal was the classic combat schizophrenic operating on reason, which told him the odds, and faith, which obscured them.